In health headlines now, asthma becomes a concern when the air quality worsens, and doctors want teachers and parents to understand how these environmental changes can affect their children. Whether it's recess or extracurricular activities, concerns about those with asthma and changes in the environment raise throughout the year.
And so for sure, there's kind of year-round types of pollution, whether it's wildfire smoke, whether it's from diesel exhaust, and kind of the way that just the environment works.
Allergies impact children with asthma as well due to their growing bodies.
Really, the entire timeline of infancy, toddlerhood, elementary school aged kids, as they're growing, as they're still pretty small, they're very, very much impacted.
And understanding the signs and when to limit outdoor activity is important for those with this condition. Staying prepared and informed is, of course, the best way to keep students safe during this time.